Hi, thank you everyone for coming. All that I need to do now is introduce our panel chair, Bridget Kendall, who is the Master of Peterhouse College and is the BBC's former chief diplomatic correspondent. Bridget has a lot of experience in chairing panel discussions like these, and I am very, very confident that she's going to be able to keep all of our 7 panelists under control. So Bridget's going to introduce the rest of the panel. Bridget.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this panel discussion on the future of science policy and research funding. It's a good point to do this as part of your day, to think more broadly, but also at this time when there's so much change happening. Internationally, there is, of course, Britain's coming withdrawal from the European Union and the impact that might have. At a national level, there are the changes in higher education, the Office of Students taking over as a new regulator for the higher education sector, and the restructuring of the UK research councils to form a new organisation, UK Research and Innovation. There's, at the government level, just this week, that cabinet reshuffle, which brings us a new Secretary of State for Education and a new Minister of Higher Education. And here in Cambridge, here at the Cavendish, the project of Cavendish 3, not just a home for physics research for the university, but a top-class facility for the nation. So, all raising lots of questions and options, and we have a great panel here today to help us field some of the queries and quandaries that we all face. We're joined by 3 politicians. Heidi Allen, in the middle, is Conservative MP for South Cambridgeshire with a degree in astrophysics, who came to politics from business, and she's a member of the Work and Pension Select Committee, was Conservative Newcomer MP of the Year in 2016 and Conservative MP of the Year in 2017. Daniel Zeichner, next to me, Labour MP for Cambridge. Before that, his jobs were in the public and private sector, including running his own business and working as a national officer for Unison. He's a lifelong pro-European. I think we all know that, Daniel. And he's chair of the all-party parliamentary group on data analytics, a national champion of Cancer Research UK and a patron of the Westminster Higher Education Forum. Dr. Julian Huppert, in the middle, was Liberal Democratic MP for Cambridge and Lib Dem spokesman for Home Affairs, Justice and Equalities. Before that, he held a university lectureship. You all know that he was here at the Cavendish. He's now founding director of the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College with a research focus on science and technology policy. Then next to them, if I could come to Professor Tom Rodden, who's Deputy CEO of the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and acted as a strategic advisor for a number of UK research councils, a member of the UK Research Assessment Exercise Panel in 2008, on the 2014 REF panel, and assessed major research endeavours in the US, Australia, Canada, throughout Europe. And he's a professor of interactive computing and director of research at the University of Nottingham. And next to him, Dr. Brian Bowsher is Chief Executive of the Science and Technology Facilities Council, with a PhD in chemistry, who began his career in nuclear technology and nuclear safety, went on to be on the executive board of the Atomic Weapons Establishment, managing director of the National Physical Laboratory and the UK's National Measurements Institute, a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and Institute of Physics, and received an OBE in the New Year's Honour for his work on metrology. And next to him, Professor Chris Abell, Pro-Vice Chancellor of this university for research, Professor of Biological Chemistry, leading 2 research teams pioneering the use of fragment-based approaches to drug discovery and developing microdroplets as an experimental cabinet. He was a founding director of Cambridge Enterprise, first director of the Postdoctoral Affairs organisation, first director of Postdoctoral Affairs at the university, a fellow of the Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences. And Professor Andy Hopper, who's rushed to be here, thank you, Andy, is Professor of Computer Technology here in Cambridge and head of the Department of Computer Science and Technology. He's also Treasurer and Vice President of the Royal Society, has co-founded 13 spin-outs and start-offs. 3 of them floated on the stock market, and among them receiving 5 Queen's Awards for Enterprise, a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society, and he was given a CBE for services to the computer industry. So thank you all very much. Let's give them a round of applause. Just briefly to let you know where we're going to go in this session, I'd like to break it down roughly into 3 parts, beginning with Brexit and the likely impact, then broaden it out a bit into wider questions of funding for science, how to maintain standards, government versus industry funding, and around the issue of basic versus fundamental research. But so we don't just have a question where we express our moans and groans. I do want at the end, given we do have new politicians in our sector just appointed, to invite the panel, anyone else if we have time, to consider what options and solutions or messages we'd like to send to decision makers at this point. But I'm going to start with the panel. I've asked them all very strictly to keep their answers quite short. For their view, their thoughts on the impact of Brexit, the likely impact of Brexit on science policy and research funding. Can I start with you, Daniel?
Of course, and thank you very much, Bridget, and welcome everybody. It's a very illustrious panel. I'd say it feels like a general election panel with an upgrade, really, a distinct upgrade. Look, I don't think it's controversial to say that Cambridge doesn't like Brexit. I don't think that we're going to find many people here who are going to be in favour of what's happened. It was a tragedy, I think, for our country, and I think a tragedy for the science and research sector. But the question is, what are we going to do and how are we going to deal with it? Incidentally, I don't rule out the possibility that it can be stopped, and we may come on to that later on. But for me, the impact, and it's fairly, I think, again, not a controversial thing to say, is on financing and money. I think it's on people, and it's on collaboration. Now, financing and money, actually, you can sort out, and I'm sure people want to talk about that, and there have been some encouraging responses from government to make promises to make up Horizon 2020 funding and so on. Collaboration, I think, is much more difficult, and I think we're seeing plenty of evidence already that we are suffering because of the changed relationship that we have. But for me, I think people is perhaps the biggest thing of all, because if we haven't got people being able to come and go, and also people feeling they're welcome here and valued here, I think that is going to be of long-lasting consequence for us. So I am an eternal optimist. I do think actually this is one policy area where there's been a fair amount of common ground across political parties and governments for some considerable time, and we will always pick over the minor differences. But I think you can trace back through the Labour government period, actually through the coalition to today. There is a recognition of just how important science and research is for our country. Very important that that message gets across. Personally, I suppose I shouldn't go on record saying that I quite liked Jo Johnson, but I actually think until perhaps the last week or so when he did get it wrong, I thought actually he'd done a reasonable job for the sector. And with a new minister who's suddenly got to deal with a lot of very complicated issues very quickly, I do worry slightly. We'll come to the end about the messages to them. But I do think it's an uncertain time, but I certainly do not remain anything other than an eternal optimist.
Julian.
Well, look, it's great to be back here, and good fun to remember. My office was just up there, so I think I had the office closest to the entrance or the escape from this hall, depending, what the quality of the talks were like. I'll be keeping an eye out on people up there. But it's a really interesting subject, and I agree with a huge amount of what Daniel said. And I think we may not see all that much disagreement here. All those issues are right. It's a shame there isn't somebody here who is a visionary for how wonderful Brexit could be. I can't quite see it myself. The BBC, before the referendum, asked if I'd be prepared to do a big set of interviews they wanted to do about science and Brexit. I said, yeah, absolutely. And then they rang back and said, look, we can't find any scientist in Cambridge who's prepared to argue the case for Brexit. Literally none. Do you know any? And I said no, and I tweeted out, and nobody could find anybody who was prepared to make that case. And so the BBC decided that they clearly couldn't report this because that would be biased. And so they didn't talk about science at all, which is slightly terrifying. I think the fact that they couldn't find a single person actually says all of the story. Daniel's absolutely right. We are seeing real effects from Brexit. We are seeing real effects on people, real effects on money. I don't know how many people here have seen grants that they were working on with European collaborators where they're just being edged off. Some are not, some are, and I've spoken to a number of people who are hit by that. So we're seeing real effects there, but I think a lot of it comes down to the uncertainty. People are unsure whether they want to come here. You have brilliant scientists, brilliant academics of all kinds who are saying, do I want to come from the US, from France, from wherever, to work in the UK or not? We don't necessarily pay as much as some places do. We have a long tradition of focusing on scholarly works rather than the pay packets that some US universities have. What we offer is that academic brilliance. If we tilt the balance away, we will cause ever more harm. Can we get out of it? I mean, I was delighted that Nigel Farage is now in favour of another referendum. I'll believe it when I see it. I would love to see it happen, because otherwise I think it's going to be a colossal disaster. Also because science is fundamentally internationalist. And the Brexit movement is a fundamentally isolationist piece, and that runs wholly against everything that science does.
Heidi.
Thank you. I never in my life thought I would welcome a debate on Brexit. I'm a little bit tired of it already, but frankly, if you'd pushed me on astrophysics, I have to tell you, I think I've probably forgotten most of it, and I wouldn't know my leptons from my protons these days. But thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's all of these things. I mean, it's seismic, isn't it? Brexit is absolutely just shifting the tectonic plates that we have grown accustomed to. And I can't pretend it's going to be easy. It isn't. I don't think a second referendum will come. I don't think Nigel Farage actually wants a second referendum. I think that's #fake news. Do I think there can be a sensible way forward between our country and Europe? Yes, I do. You know, because as we've heard, absolutely right, science is, never mind European, it's global. And it's one person with an idea talking to another person who can make it better, talking to another. And I think although with trade and the financial services market, yeah, there's a bit of testosterone going on between Europe and us at the moment about whether we're going to go single market and we don't need you. I think science actually has a chance to be bigger than that. And I think European countries, you know, we're the top 5 collaborators with all of the EU nations for science. And I think all countries recognise that most science, you know, it's not local, it's not regional, it's for global purpose, whether it's medical advances to help EU global citizens. And I think the government get it. As Daniel was saying, I think they understand and have been perhaps clearer on what Brexit might mean for this sector than others. Others were still, you know, waiting to hear more detail. Just locally, the fact that government want to put a railway here to connect us with Oxford, that it literally took me 30 seconds to convince Chris Grayling that we needed a station on the biomedical campus at Addenbrooke's. That tells me government, more than ever, are alive to the value of science and R&D, because I think we are the greatest hope for our economy post-Brexit. And we need to trumpet that, because we are very, very important to the UK's economy. So it's scary. I don't know how the path is going to go, but I am confident, because I think we are too important globally for our sector not to come out of this positively.
Tom Rodden.
So thanks very much for having me. So going third hard. It's going to be harder down there. So a lot of the things I've said have been covered here. So in terms of Brexit, I mean, funding, obviously, you would think for a funding council would be something that EPSRC would worry about. But actually, I think, I agree, it's about the people and it's about the researchers. And I'll just personalise this. I mean, my wife is a non-UK EU citizen, and the personal impact of doing that and managing a research career where we think about the statuses is significant. And I'm sure there are many people in the room who have suddenly got this additional stressor in their life that's impacting them. I think we need to think carefully about that and think about how to manage that. And research is collaboration, and it's fundamentally collaboration. And I think all of the stats, all of the reports, the Royal Society report in terms of funding, the work at Elsevier have done about the positive contribution shows the contribution of non-UK EU citizens. We are, I mean, as an academic joining a research council, it's very un-British. We are the best in the world at this stuff. And it's unquestionably we're the best in the world. 1% of the UK, 1% of the world's population, 16% of the papers in the top 10 citations worldwide. It's quite clear that we're strong. And it's quite clear that, and this is where I want to actually let you think about this, because I think, seeing beyond the immediate debate, I do think that there has been a recognition of the importance of science. Science has moved from the sidelines to front and centre. It's one of the 10 pillars in the original industrial strategy. It's named as one of the negotiating principles in Brexit. And as scientists, you might want to reflect on whether you want pulled as quickly and as fast into that and what that means for you as scientists. So there's an additional 4.7 billion predicated on that, which the government has given. You're seeing the industrial strategy emerge, and you're seeing the nature and role of science. And as an asset for the UK in a post-Brexit economy, it makes a massive sense for lots of the innovation in the UK to be based on this. And I think what you want to think about as researchers is what does that mean for you and the type of research that you want to do.
Brian.
Thank you. Just to add to my pleasure at being here, and just to add to what colleagues have said, I'll use the same headings that Daniel did, the finance, the people, and the collaboration. Like other colleagues, the finance is important, but it's not the critical thing. And I'm aware in some parts of our community, astronomy, for example, typically 60% of the funds for the work in astronomy are coming from the EU. It's similarly true in archaeology, but in other areas it's less important, but we can, in a sense, compensate for some aspects of the money. The next is critical is the people, and on the people, I see it on both sides. We have the pleasure of running many large-scale international facilities, and I've got about 200 colleagues who are working in Europe in different large-scale experiments. And suddenly there's huge pressures and uncertainties, as colleagues have said, associated with their future. Not so much for them, but for their children and their children's children. It's interesting, some of those international experiments, again reflecting earlier colleagues' comments, some of those are purely European, things like CERN, and they are international, they are global. Others are more EU-linked, and that's where we have some difficult tensions at the moment. On the people side, I'm less worried, frankly, about the high-powered academics in this room. I think, on the whole, they will find positions across Europe, across the world, because they have those positions. But we did an assessment of research infrastructures of big facilities, things like Diamond, ISIS. And typically we have 15% of the users come from the EU. And many of those people are at the technical support level that don't automatically get the visas. And that's a group I'm particularly concerned to provide the mobility there. And then the last part is collaboration. And in a sense, I'd also put it as leadership, because I do worry some things that the EU has given us in some parts of our sector have been particularly important. I'm conscious of colleagues working at UKAEA who's dependent on Euratom and suddenly decided that that was going to be part of the reasons for leaving. I'm aware of colleagues at the Purbright Institute that are the reference laboratory for a number of European diseases and have suddenly taken that role away. Colleagues at the European Medicines Agency that is now being relocated. And that leadership position we've had in some key areas is much harder to replicate. But like Tom, I'll finish with the positive and say, well, actually, the good news, I think the government has recognised this. We do see a significant commitment into the funding position, 4.7 billion extra in the next few years, then the commitment to get to 2.4%. We do see, I think, the recognition that the science and technology can help the UK's productivity, but it's not going to be easy.
Thank you. Chris, the view from Cambridge University.
Yes, I was going to say, so I obviously echo a lot of sentiments, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to say a little bit about what the university is doing. So I have, actually since before the referendum, been chairing the Europe Committee, which is an operational committee which looks at the effect as we are drip-fed information about what's going to happen in the future. So we know that essentially EU students are going to continue to be treated like UK students for several years to come. We know what's going to happen into 2019. We're beginning to get clarity about what is happening now to the end of 2020. What's going to happen beyond that is we have no idea at all. What is really causing us huge problem is the slow rate at which we are able to get information. We are very soon going to have to be planning for students who are going to be arriving in 2019, and we don't know whether or not those EU students, what fees they're going to be paying. So how can we plan and run an organisation against that background of uncertainty? I chair the Europe Committee, and Duncan Maskell, PBC in charge of planning and resources, chairs a new committee that we've set up to discuss sort of strategies around what we're going to do. And one of the messages that we have to work out how to do is how to make the messaging positive. And that's quite difficult. I think a lot of the argument so far, everything I look at and think about, almost everything, is going to not be as good as it currently is. And a lot of the argument is how to maintain as much of where we are as we can and how to slow down essentially the rate of decline. And that's a terribly, terribly pessimistic view. I think there are one or two positive things that you can pull out of it. And I think from a university point of view, Brexit has forced us, I think, to start to think more strategically as an institution than I think we have done in our recent history. We've got a long, long way to go, but it's desperately important that we do. We have been enormously successful at getting ERC funding, but that has been at the fact that we've stopped really applying to the EPSRC. So we've gone from being top recipient of EPSRC money to 6th recipient of EPSRC money. There's clearly ways back. The funding is the thing that I'm least worried about. The people and the collaborations are what I'm most concerned about. Not just about attracting people here, I'm really worried about keeping people here.
Right, well, so despite my surname, I'm a Polish immigrant. So you can imagine, I'm one of those, who apparently some people don't want here. I was born and brought up in Poland, and I'm fluent in that culture. But let's put that to one side. As a businessman, with my companies and other companies I work with, I don't say anything about Brexit much. I act in a rational way. A company won't say, oh, because of Brexit and so on. We just get on, try and make money. And that involves, in one case, planning to move the company out of the country. It won't appear like that, but that's what will happen because customers are saying, we want you closer, they're EU customers. In other cases, say software company, that's a little more subtle. On the one hand. On the other hand, the pound has tanked, we're cheaper, it's easier to sell stuff, the stock market's gone up, so there is a positive side for bad reason because it's the cheap pound. And so your exports are cheaper, you're more competitive, but actually for a high-value economy, value-added economy, that's not so good. So that's on the business side. On the research funding side, what to do about it is because, I just say I'm Polish and let's leave it at that. I think there's quite an important ask which I think one could do to government right now. So my assessment of the tactics really is that research funding for university is not the most important thing on government's agenda, right? I mean, we think we're important, but it's not a huge amount of money and so on. So I think we can have, and essentially, as far as I can tell, everybody's agreed it's an important thing and just get on with solving the pollution. Let's deal with other stuff, is my assessment. Now the panelists maybe correct me from a political point of view. So we can ask. So I think we as a community, and we meaning the European community, and by that I mean I include the UK, should say, for research funding, we want no change from before. And the point is, I think this is possibly attainable, right? But the ask would be strong. No change from before. We participate in everything, in EU, in ERC, in the European Innovation Fund, right? Because that's important. And with the addition that anybody who gets accepted by that sort of program automatically and their family has the right to travel and residence and all the rest of it. It's just automatic, right? So that we don't change anything, and that's the ask, and it's a coordinated ask. And because we're not that important, really, I mean, I think we are, but you see what I mean, in terms of, and everybody's desperate to do something positive, some deal, including the politicians right now, in particular the politicians, that I think, modular maybe another referendum, we might be able to achieve that, which at least, for our sector, would be, I think, wonderful. Now, can I just point out a little wrinkle? That requires us saying to our European colleagues, please endorse this, and endorse that for other sectors there may not be travel. So it's actually asking quite a big ask of them, because they'll have to give perhaps in their own minds about what it is that they will agree to support us on.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had various concerns raised, perhaps not surprising to many of us. Let's just bore into a couple of them. Let's start with people. And the point that Chris Abell made, that this isn't just about a brain drain in one direction or the problem of attracting people, but the problem of keeping them. And it'd be good to hear some views from the floor. I think, is Laith Alexander here? Yes, we have this magnificent microphone. I've never seen one like it in my over 30 years of broadcasting, so I don't know who invented this. This is great. You can actually throw it to each other, and it magically turns off as you throw it, and then you speak into it. Let me...
So, yes, I have a question. So, as a British scientist, why should I stay in the UK after Brexit if in the future I want to set up a lab with international appeal to, countries outside of Europe, but obviously also countries within Europe?
Anyone else like to add their thoughts to that? Reinforce it? Disagree with it? Very shy lot. Yes.
Hi, I'm a journalist for Research Fortnight. I wanted to ask if academics at Cambridge have been approached by other universities in the European Union offering them positions, and what the government should do to prevent them from moving to those universities. Thank you.
Let's take this to you, Chris, as that's questions about the university.
Okay. So there's anecdotal information. There's anecdotal information about people who we were in the mid-process of recruiting, who said, let's wait until the referendum happens, and then they decided on balance, if that's the way the country is going, they didn't want to come. So there are examples of that. One of my colleagues is a Pro-Vice Chancellor. He is so upset about Brexit. He's going off to multiply his salary by about a factor of 5 and work in Australia instead. So it might not just be Brexit that's driving him abroad. But no, in essence, a lot of people work in the higher education sector in this country on internationally non-competitive salaries because there's something very special about being in the UK and something very special about being in Cambridge. And you don't need a lot when you're actually making a lot of sacrifices to be here already to encourage you, right, that's the final straw. I will go to Germany, I will triple my salary, I will go and work for the Max Planck Institute. So yes, we do know of cases of people in the university who are reflecting on their current status. What I should say is, and I'm not saying this will happen, if we didn't have access to ERC funding or some replacement for it, I think it would get very critical very quickly.
Julian?
In terms of are there people who have left? Yes, absolutely there are. Would there have been people in a typical year who would have left? Yes, absolutely. There are some who leave all the time. Earlier this year, I and my colleagues did some freedom of information requests around the universities, and there is a very clear increase in the number of people leaving, EU people leaving. If you drop me a line, I can send you some of the raw details for that. So that is definitely happening. What should we do about it? And part of the problem is that salary issue. The pound going down means that salaries here look even worse compared to what they look like previously. So it's always a question, how much do you care? There's a lovely line, I think it's Rutherford, who said, we haven't got any money, so we'll have to think. And Cambridge has focused on that approach of making sure that the thinking is prioritised. We now get some more money as well, but the more you bias that away, the harder it is and the more problems there are. To pick up your question, it goes back to an issue about how we make sure that research funding and thinking about the policies around science happens over a very long term. Because pumping bits of money or sorting things out for a year or two doesn't help with the question that you might be asked about, where should I set up my lab? It's great if I know there'll be money for the next 2 years, for the next 3 years. I want to have a lab in 15 years. Do I know anything about that at all? So years ago, I wrote a science policy paper for the Lib Dems, which was arguing for a 15-year settlement of above-inflation increases for 15 years. The idea, is very naive, I accept, was to try to get cross-party agreement that we would do this so that people could say, look, I know there will be research funding available. If I'm good, there will be cash. I won't discover in 5-10 years that I can't do it. The same has to happen for the people side of it. Now, we shouldn't imagine that it's currently perfect. If you've ever been involved with getting non-EU people into the UK, into labs, and that applies at the technician level very badly, applies at high levels, it applies at the professorial level of people not getting visas to come here for conferences. We already have those problems, and people come here and run very good labs. it's a shame that we're going to be making it harder for people rather than solving those problems, but it can be done. But the earlier we provide long-term certainty over people access, permanently but also temporarily, the better it will be and the more you will feel tempted to set up a lab in a brilliant place like this.
Daniel, you want to say something?
A brief observation on the point about people going. A number of us have been trying to work with other colleagues to try and actually find out what is actually happening, because we're all hearing it anecdotally. But of course, one of the real difficulties for institutions is the last thing they want to be doing is publicly admitting they just appointed the fourth best person, the other three pulled out. They can't do it. So it is really, really hard to actually get the evidence base. And I suppose what I would just say generally to people is, okay, I understand it has to be done confidentially, but do tell us what's going on, because it gives us more clout.
Heidi, do you want to give a thought here?
I mean, so there's the mechanical stuff that the government's looking at. You know, they really want, we've got an immigration bill coming, an immigration white paper, and I've had, it's a shame Brandon Lewis has moved on actually, because I was working very well with him. He's not daft, and he knows how important this sector is. It's not just our sector, but this one particularly, looking at making it easier for brains and skills to move and their families associated with that, financially easier, administrationally easier, so that we, from a process point of view, we can not give ourselves any additional hurdles. I suppose the, I'm kind of thinking out loud here a little bit, so forgive me, but there's a part of me that, because this is very volatile, this situation, and it's not going to settle anytime soon. And yes, I don't want it to be difficult for us to get the right brains here, of course not. But, you know, this is kind of people and Brownian motion in a funny sort of way. And actually, if we do lose, I guess inverted commas lose, some of those to another European country, maybe actually that strengthens our argument. And could there be a better place in future where actually we've realised that these people really are mobile? So never mind how things used to be, things can be even more fluid. And I quite like the idea, I think it was you that said about like a family automatic right to move. I like that. So that we turn this into an even more global, fluid community than it ever was. Because you have to find, okay, this is a problem, let's pull apart the jigsaw pieces, but you've got to find out where you want to get to. And maybe this is part of that journey. I don't know, but let's make this community even more global.
Yes, Andy.
So, I can just report to you just some facts, and perhaps it's not as bad. And it's essentially, this university, for all its wrinkles, is fabulous. And the reason it's fabulous is because it's got tremendous flexibility in how each subject, how each domain can cut its cloth at any particular moment. And therefore, I think it makes it more competitive. So I'm head of the department next door, which used to have Microsoft next door, and the pay gradient across there was a factor of 3, and for me it was a factor of 5, I think, okay? So never mind Brexit, there it was, right? And I can just report to you, as a matter of fact, that of the last few appointments which have been since Brexit, early career people, one came from the US, one came from Switzerland, and it's not by buying them, you know, the pay is miserable, right? It's nothing to do with that. They have arrived. Now, why is this? And here are some reasons that on that patch, this will be a little different here, but on that patch, I say, you know, you can do unlimited consulting. Would you like me to fix you some? Oh, yes, please. All right. So we fix consulting if that's what they want. By the way, the ref, you know, it's interesting, but it's not the dominant thing here. We have to work it. It's serious, but, you know, work not to the ref, but how are you going to change the world? Excuse me? Okay. By the way, you don't have to be tattooed Microsoft or Bill Gates if you're in this building. In fact, figure out how to take them out of business. What's your story? So if you display, you know, if you, and the point is the university, the Pro-Vice Chancellor Research doesn't beat me up if I don't say ref is the most important thing in the world, right?
Not in public.
Not in public, yeah. So do you see what I mean? And so we can, and it's all terrible in some ways, but on the other hand, I can just report to you what's happened. We've got our first choice recruits coming since then, and here are some of the reasons. And I think those reasons are very important and will continue.
Yes, Brian and Tom, you both wanted to come in. Yeah, do.
So just to add to the positivity, because clearly at the moment, in terms of setting up, it is a time of uncertainty, and that always makes decisions difficult. The two positives to build on what Andy was just saying. The first is, despite some difficult issues, and not least some of the flat cash that we've had for the previous environment, actually we still have fabulous reputation, both here in Cambridge locally, but if we take the work that we support in particle physics, astronomy, nuclear physics, genuinely by all the measures, not number one in Europe, number one worldwide, number two worldwide. So that gives you the right place. And personally, I wouldn't be going to Australia because their funding commitments that have been made by the government at the moment aren't inspirational. And if I look at what the current government has said in terms of the 4.7 billion, the extra that's going in, and that what all parties have committed to in terms of the 2.4% commitment to spend on R&D, that gives me confidence that we've got actually the right sort of environment in which the work can be undertaken.
So, I mean, I want to respond directly to you as a kind of early career researcher. So my role was often a bit of a custodian of the UK's research landscape. But let's start with me thinking about this as an academic. Ideas matter and ideas persist. Frankly, politicians come and go. Funding councils come and go. The science remains, the curiosity remains, and the drive remains. So if you're making these choices, think that way. Don't think about responding to think of your time frame. I think, given that, I want to point out a couple of things about the UK. I mean, my job is to convince parliamentarians about the strength of the UK through a whole range of metrics. And it's really quite easy because the metrics are incredibly strong. They're incredibly strong because of the structure of the UK's research base. We've got a couple of unique things here. We've got dual support. Now, dual support combines the support to the universities to allow open-ended, curiosity-driven research and speculative stuff alongside targeted one. We do have, and we stick to, although contended and debated, things like the Halliday Principle, which says the decisions about what funding is and where funding takes place rests with the science, not necessarily with the vagaries of politicians. I have a number of colleagues in the US who have had multi-million-dollar projects closed in the social sciences because of speeches at the White House. So all of those things are the backbone of the UK's belief system in research. And part of the job is to get through perturbations like this with those value systems intact. And I'm fairly confident of a kind of uniform agreement that that's the job at hand here. The job at hand is to get through this and remain with the same kind of value system. So that's what I would say to encourage you to stay and encourage you to think about it.
It's very interesting hearing all the responses, because some things come through, like that this is about culture, flexibility and curiosity, but it is also about money. But also, I heard very loudly what Chris Abell said about, and also Andy Huppert, we wanted to stay the same. In other words, we're in a good place, and we want to preserve this, and we like to argue this is why you should be here. But the worry is, if this is seismic, as Heidi said, will it stay the same, or are we managing a slow decline because of the change of context? This brings us back to funding and the shift in funding. And if I could draw on Andy Parker, if you'd like to take the orange dice, to give us your question about Brexit and funding.
Yeah, I mean, I was encouraged that everybody seems to think the money's going to keep flowing. But just as important...
Hold it up a bit.
Sorry, just as important is how the money is deployed and under what criteria. Now, the attraction of the ERC funding to many Cambridge academics is that it's awarded solely on the basis of scientific excellence. So if the money is transferred into the existing UK infrastructure and funding mechanisms, the dual support system has, over the years, gradually shifted more and more towards program-driven and further away from curiosity-driven, and we see that continuing with the industrial strategy. So what effect would it have on the research ecosystem if we had the same amount of money, but it was all pushed through UKRI and we didn't have access to the ERC?
Anyone else like to add to this? Anyone else have thoughts on this? Yes, gentlemen.
So just to second Andy's question, so I hold both an EPSRC fellowship and also an ERC grant. And Chris spoke about this Cambridge not getting as much EPSRC money, and we can ask a question of why that is. And the ERC is very attractive, it's very high risk, and it's sort of very sort of science really at the edge, which may not be compatible with the coming sort of industrial strategies, sort of this in the two-channel delivery mechanism. And so for a young academic such as myself, I look at this with great dread. So the thing I did after watching the Brexit result that morning, as I sort of came out of the days, I immediately went to the ERC website and decided I had to apply that year, which was sort of one of my last chances. And so for us, and this is true for many of my colleagues, we worry about how this money, which, you know, even if the quanta of money is the same, if it gets fed through the existing EPSRC, UKRI channels, it will shift the emphasis of the science and shift the risk that science is willing to take. Because some of the European money, especially the ERCs, is willing to take a really high level of risk, which in my experience and that of others, EPSRC is not willing to take at the moment.
Thank you. Anyone else like to add thoughts here? Yes, gentlemen, yeah. Throw it. Whoa.
So at the moment we have the dual support mechanism, and that's quite good. We have a nice science environment. Post-Brexit, while we believe we're going to maintain skilled, high-value workers within the science fields, that may not be the case elsewhere, if we take agriculture for example. So it may become an imperative for the government to direct funding into industries that are necessary for the survival of the industry and indeed the people in the UK. And I was wondering, does the panel have any thoughts on that?
Let's come back to the panelists. Can we start with you, Daniel?
Yeah, and let me introduce a slight note of disagreement, because there's been lots of agreement so far. I'm not convinced the money will keep flowing, because I'm not sure the money is going to be there, because I think people are underestimating the scale of the economic shock we may be facing, and it's exactly the point that you make, that at that point there will be political choices made, and the political choices will be driven by a whole range of imperatives that politicians are seeing on their television screens, and that will be immediate things like what do you do for the health service, what do you do for schools. Agriculture, I don't think, will be up there at the top, which will come as a surprise to some of the farmers who voted for Brexit. But I have to say also, I'm not sure that science and research will be up there at the top. Second point, and I think the dual funding point is really important, one thing that's always struck me about the benefit of the European Union for every national government is you can always transfer the blame and the responsibility somewhere else. So while Europe can do the right things, national governments can do the popular things. And kind of, we know that, politicians know it, and it's a convenient fiction in a way. By taking this away and bringing it back into taking back control, you also take back responsibility. And that is going to be much, much tougher for government. So I would really worry. And I don't think it's just the Brexit issue, incidentally. Having praised Joe Johnson earlier, I was just reflecting, of course, that on the Research and Higher Education Bill, a lot of us did worry about the continual erosion of the dual funding principle. And UKRI, well, we'll see how it cracks out. But I think it's going the wrong direction. So I think there are real risks ahead.
Heidi, yes.
So I think, I mean, yes, political change is always difficult because different agendas, different priorities. So you can only work with the government as it is now, today, and what it's saying. And we've heard a couple of times repeated this ambition of 2.4% spend GDP on R&D. That's the biggest ever. I think that's bigger than any other European nation. So that suggests, you know, that's reinforced in the budget, that's there in stone. That's an aspiration that is there, which has to be a good starting point. A few issues mentioned. Do we end up going down a road of programming and funneling money towards industry-related quick fix as opposed to the more creative exploratory stuff? Well, different area of science, but the Genome Campus, for many, many years, that didn't have practical return, but the government saw the need for future. A lot of science, as we know, is not about what you fix and learn today. It's what you don't know you're going to learn until you're 2 years down the line. So I think there are some practical examples of where the government, current and previous, have already got that. Daniel's right about shifting priorities for money, but I take hope and contentment in the fact that some of the themes in the industrial strategy for prioritisation of R&D money address both. So the challenges of an ageing population, So actually, if we can deal with that innovatively and funnel some of our R&D money in there, it will solve or help to solve something that might become a financial pressure later on that might avert us and want us to spend our money on something else. So I think I'm seeing in the government strategy so far a good balance of R&D being used for here and now industrial problems that we know about, fix those, and it frees up revenue to help you fix the things that you don't know about just yet. So I think it's that getting that balance right. And the fact that the government are very, very clearly putting science, life sciences, R&D so high up on their priorities, that tells me they know that this is the solution for the future. And yes, there will be other priorities that will come and go and make headlines. But I think every parliamentarian, regardless of who's in government at the time, we just have to continue making the case, keep doing the science and proving the value of it.
But do you think, Heidi, that it does mean that Blue Sky's thinking will have a harder time making its case?
Well, I mean, everybody has a role in this. It's not for government just to be the one that gets all the answers right. Everybody has a role in the same way as, yes, you could go to Australia, whatever it might be, but you have a role, I have a role to make this country and this science stay. I could leave, you could leave, but actually there's personal responsibility in this. So I think we all have a role to play to prove the case. You know, Julian, I remember you lamented when you were in Parliament that there weren't enough scientists in there, and that still remains a problem. But that's not a reason to moan about it. That's a reason for those of us that understand and get it to keep pushing the case and prove the point. Don't just expect your message to be heard. You have to keep delivering it.
Julian.
Look, I'm a bit more sceptical about whether the quantum of money will be there, and I think, unfortunately, science research funding is one of the things which can get hit. In 2010, there was a flash cash settlement, but until a couple of days before the spending round was concluded, there was going to be a very large cut in science research funding by 200 million a year. And there was, it's a fascinating tale how we managed to get that changed, but that could easily have happened because there isn't the political pressure to invest in science and research in general. There are headlines about how much money goes into the NHS, into welfare, into all sorts of things. But there isn't much here, partly because scientific research is often quite long-term. We talk about the returns to the economy, and they are very, very real. But I think it would be stretching the point to say that you get the money back this year. It's, you know, much, much longer than that. Also because scientists and academics tend to step out of politics, and they don't get engaged. People don't vote for people or parties who say good things about science and research. There's that sense, and I speak now, I guess, with a scientific hat on, that it's a bit, politics is a bit messy. And we sort of, it's not quite our thing, that's for other people to do, and scientists stay out of it. And I found this time and time again. And that means there isn't a strong voice. You occasionally get things, there are some interesting groups trying to do that, but it's not taken seriously. And I think most politicians see the risks as relatively easy to cope with because you won't get major headlines if you cut money in science. That's been true around the world. I think the case is strong, but it's harder to make. And I think one of the problems is that where the case is stronger and is made more, and certainly was while I was in Parliament, was the relatively short-term return, the stuff which is closer to achievement. And that's a real problem. I think there's a bit of a cultural clash. I mean, most academics fundamentally want to work on things which are quite neat and cool. You know, we're all basically quite interested in the thing that we work on, and if it's useful, that's great. But the driver is really the fact that this is just really nice. I know my own research, unusual DNA structures, biophysics, bioinformatics, I just thought they were really pretty and really, really interesting. It then turns out they're interesting anti-cancer drug targets, and I'm delighted about that. It's really good that they're useful and being used for all sorts of things. I didn't know that when I started. How does that ever get funded? Heidi's example of the Wellcome of the Sanger is a really, really interesting one. But if we didn't have the Wellcome Trust, and I think as a country we're incredibly lucky to have the Wellcome Trust, I don't think that would ever have happened. You know, the Wellcome is able to say, we don't care, we've just got loads of money, we'll throw money into this thing because we think it's quite neat. I really worry that that's going to pull back. We'll have to see what happens economically. I think we will see, we are already seeing slower economic growth over the last year compared to estimates, compared to other countries. If that continues, there'll be even more pressure on government budgets. And imagine you were Chief Secretary of the Treasury, you had to work out where to take money from that would cause the least amount of pain. Realistically, how high up, how long would you wait before money came out of the science and research budgets? I really worry that's where it will go. It's a very short-term solution, it just makes the problem worse in future years, but people often want to survive for this year and next year, not 5 years and 10 years.
It's interesting what you're saying, Julian, because on the one hand you say there's a problem because some scientists, academics, don't engage enough to make their case to protect the funding. But on the other hand, you know, coming back to Andy's question about whether a shift in where the funding comes from will mean that pure research is less protected because there are all these political imperatives around it, you have to raise the question about that dreaded word impact. And I'd like to bring Tom in here and just ask the question, do you think there's too much focus on impact? Or will there be more for the future?
That was more than one question. Just to be a bit pedantic, and I'll try and get to your question and start here. But before I do that, it's probably worth me giving a little kind of explaining the processes that are at play here, because there's a kind of presumption of the way the world works in some of the ways that question's framed. The reality of what happens now in the UKRI context is that we, as a funding council, you spend time writing business cases into your sponsor governmental department that eventually goes to ministers. So there's a dialogue and a debate that happens, and the role of myself and Brian is to make the best possible case to support the sorts of science that we think are most important. And if that's curiosity-driven research, now obviously there's imperative and pressures about delivery and short-term impact, but part of our role is the push to open up a different space and open up ones. So part of the answer to your question would be, I will be making an argument which says that if the negotiations go in a particular way, the consequential impact on the footprint of the research base in the UK, of the ERC, needs to be dealt with, and needs to be dealt with for the long-term strength of the UK research base. And I'll turn to you to get that information to make that sort of case. So it will shift and it will change. And to give you some indications of what that might mean, when you look at the white paper that came out in the industrial strategy, which is where a lot of the most recent UK funding was announced, you will also see a significant investment in talent and skills, which isn't necessarily going to talk about those going to be orientated to Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund in and of itself. You will see within it a discussion about a future priority, strategic priorities theme as well. So all of those debates will happen and will continue to happen. So I wouldn't want you to presuppose that because it goes from route through Europe to a route through EPSRC, our models won't change. That's not what the process is. So they will shift and change in that regard. In terms of the impact and the impact agenda, I mean, there's always an interest in, I mean, this gets to the kind of, the Hamden principle and the whole set of issues about the research. And I think there's a couple of things you want to say here. One of which is I think that when we look at impact as EPSRC, one of the exercises that we did was we went through the REF impact statements, right, which is the impact case studies, and we found an answer to how long does it take for research to go from basic research to impact. And the answer is, if you sample this over a 20-year period, the answer is 10 years plus or minus 10. Right? It's just such a variable space, okay? And I think that you don't want to be driven entirely by impact. I certainly wouldn't want to predict impact. Coming from computer science, the variability in impact is incredible. And it's either explosive or it's very, very long-term burn, you know? I mean, the Reverend Bayes is not a new phenomenon, for example. So I think there is an emphasis on impact. I think the emphasis on impact is a legitimization, does unlock resources from Treasury. I do want to end now in a little bit of a kind of thing about a broader political statement. Now, this is me think, one of the worries you might have is when you look at the driving forces under some of the issues around the debates about Brexit and the debates about this. I think the impact agenda is to hits parts of the country differently. And I think how different areas with really complex fundamental science talk about the localised delivery of that value is an important feature to think about the relationship between academic institutions and the towns that they're in. And I think that there's a number of places where that needs to be thought of as well.
Heidi, you just wanted to come in.
Just a small thing, just reflecting on that. So the other way of looking at this is maybe politicians push back a little bit to you. No industry, no sector can be untouched by Brexit. Nobody can be wrapped in cotton wool and said, well, we're not participating. I remember my husband used to work for Audi, who had a fabulous product and they couldn't make enough of the cars. Audi is not participating in the recession. It was the Audi European line. We're not participating. We can't do that. Every sector, every industry is going to feel something because of Brexit. So my pushback would be, possibly as we go through this, maybe the grants you are looking for, you do adjust a little bit the type of work that you want funding. Maybe you do balance it a little bit to give the government what it wants to generate some revenue. Maybe for a short period, the scientific industry does need to, I don't know, instead of 2/3 blue sky, 1/3 practical, faster impact, maybe you adjust that percentage a little bit for the longer term sustainability of the industry. This is a transitional period and we all have to play our part, and none of us can say that we refuse to be touched by it, because we're the same food chain together and we all have to participate in this and come through the other side together.
Brian.
So just 2 points. First of all, going back to Andy's question, I'll inject a bit of controversy because overall in recent history, I don't think that the UK has invested enough in the innovation side of things compared with the fundamental science. And it's worth reminding us, particularly to this audience, that Mr. Haldane actually had 2 principles. He had the first one, which said that curiosity-driven research should be driven by the individual researchers, and that's one that we tend to focus in academia. He also said that publicly driven research and mission-driven research should be undertaken by government laboratories. And that was a network that has been allowed to decline and reduce significantly in the last 20 or so years. Fortunately, I think with the initially the Labour government and then the coalition government, there was a strong commitment to the industrial strategy. And after a certain uncertainty about the level of investment in industry-related work, I think the current industrial strategy is absolutely addressing some of those things. And therefore, I welcome those broadly extra funding going into that innovation sector. So having then made the controversial bit to try and get friends again, I do recognise that actually a lot of this new work is being built on a foundation that has been a bit eroded by some of the flat cash in recent years. And actually, if we're going to sustain our excellence in our research, we do need to actually address some of that fundamental science as well, because actually I think some of these new things are great, but the foundations are a bit eroded and need, I think, that fundamental research being invested in.
I completely agree with the position about the baseline and the nature of kind of foundation.
Sorry, speak up.
So I completely agree with the issue about baseline and the need to maintain a strong foundation as well.
Can I just ask you, Brian, on the question of the restructuring of the research councils, what difference do you think that will make? Because obviously this is aimed at more integration, but could it lead to a bias towards bigger grants to consortia rather than the ability of smaller projects? Sometimes if you're dealing with something risky and experimental, it has to start off small and therefore might make it harder.
It's difficult to say. It's a bit like Daniel's comment about the money. It was the start of something that hasn't even yet got established to the 1st of April. I therefore speculate along the following lines. First of all, I think that the UKRI leadership, people like John Kingman and Mark Allport, have been extraordinarily successful in making the case to government for additional investment, and I think that's good. I think there's also been a commitment broadly to leave the current pillars of the current research councils as is. But one of the interesting things is that I think there's sometimes this perception that there was a big problem that needed to be fixed. I don't think there is a big problem. I think the research councils have worked well together. I think we can increase how we work with our colleagues and innovate and do that better. But actually both here at Cambridge, where you see some of the clusters that bring together the academic and the industrial applications. We have similar ones at Harwell, where you have perhaps 300 companies alongside the pure science. I see there's a little bit more benefit in being able to do things in a big science way. And the last area is perhaps a positive point associated with the Brexit. Tom's highlighted some of the investment in the regional agenda to support that. And I would also see some significant additional investments in bilateral international agreements as well, because I think actually some of the bigger activities, the CERNs, the square kilometre arrays, the European spallation sources, they are bigger than any country. They need international investment, and many of those core capabilities, I think, will be needing global input.
Chris, your view from the university's point of view, are you concerned about this debate there is over...
Well, yeah, so specifically to Andy's point, I mean, basically, at the moment, we put a lot of money into the European Union, and a certain amount of that is assigned to maybe what we put in towards ERC, and apparently we get out more than we put in, if you think about it in that kind of boxed way. It's very hard to imagine at any time in the future, whatever the settlement is, that we could get out more than we put in, and presumably, if we do put in, and there are mechanisms by which that might happen, our government will probably limit that, and thereby implicitly limit our success. If at some time in the future we are still in the ERC because we are paying in for it, what we will have done is thrown away our influence in setting the agenda and choosing it. So everything is a degradation of where we are at present. If, as, and I think is more likely at the moment, that the money is instead handed over to UKRI, then the best we can hope for maybe is that it goes to the academies and it then is handled and ring-fenced, and there are some rules about keeping it blue sky. But again, that is a budget that can be cut fairly easily. But on the other hand, you could, and the government has made these arguments, or arguments have been made, is you could configure that to be better than the ERC, to include other countries that are currently excluded, etc. So I think if we did go to that, there are definitely going to be negatives, and one would have to work very hard to look for positives. I think there's a nervousness in universities that UKRI is being led, or the leadership of UKRI essentially is not somebody who is strongly from a university background. They've come from a, and so the jury is going to be out for, I think, a considerable time to see whether or not the future of British science is investing in universities or investing, as we've seen very much in the last 3 or 4 years, in national institutes like the Crick, like the Royce, like the Rosalind Franklin Institute, which essentially are all in one way good, but they are messing up the landscape in a very complicated way, and it's hard to know how that's going to play out.
Do you think that, quite apart from how it plays out, it's going to take some time for this complicated landscape to sort itself out? How much danger there is of reputational damage, say for British science or Cambridge University in particular? Because if you're no longer being measured by doing incredibly well among other European competitors and getting a lot of funding back, but it's handed to you because this is part of a national strategy, because it's made a priority, is this a worry that it somehow makes the UK look less competitive?
I think we have to look attractive, we have to look competitive, not least for the next ref that's not too far away in the future, and to get people to come here and get people to stay here. I think, you know, what is happening here, in a way we're lucky or unlucky, because things to some extent are not steaming ahead full steam in the US at the moment. Where they are steaming ahead full steam is in Asia, and we are seeing phenomenal increases in the ranking and rating of some of the better universities in Asia. And that, for people, I mean, I encourage everybody who has the opportunity to go out there and look at the scale of what's happening there, the speed at what's happening there. Those places aren't going to overtake, you know, the history of Cambridge and the reputation of Cambridge very quickly, but they are, what's happening there is on a frightening scale. And I think we are not best placed to compete with them when we're dealing with all the issues we're currently having to inflict on ourselves.
That's interesting you say that, because it raises another point, doesn't it, which is that for all the concerns about Brexit, it forces us into fresh thinking. And maybe one area of fresh thinking is, what are the other sources of funding, not just from governments, but possibly from industry? So a question to you, Andy Huppert. Do you think that there is an openness in the private sector to basic research?
It depends. That's a big, complex question. Let me answer it in two ways. Now, I just want to say a few words about impact. The world's getting more disruptive, more competitive. So the big companies are being disrupted more and more, although the big ones are very important. Digital is invading everything. That's one of the reasons for the disruption. And therefore, so to speak, both from industry, there's an appetite, but it's for people, it's not for research, right? They want the very best people who walk out of here, which is all you lot, to be employed by them. That's what they want. And everything else is nice, but, you know, that's kind of on top. And they have, the digital disrupting, so that's actually more opportunity for impact. So let me just say, just a paradox, I point out a paradox, which is I think most people are interested in the word impact and having some influence, whatever that means, in their work. I don't think that's itself any kind of an issue. And if you show people some industrial problems or social problems or challenges, they'll listen to it, and it frequently, in my experience, affects them, and they change what they do in their particular expertise with that at the back of the mind. So communication exposure, I think, is very important. But I think, my experience, I'll just be this public audience, I'll just, add a few decibels to what I'm really saying, is that the way we then implement this impact agenda through the REF, through things, is to make it worse rather than better. And the core of it is that there is, in my experience, best innovation doesn't happen directly pay per company output. There's one change in the middle. It's indirect. It's not too far removed, but there's a change of strategy, of technology. Something happens, opportunity. It's not direct output. And by and large, the REF and the impact agenda and technology transfer office and the vice chancellors will have foghorns display the direct thing as a priority, and that's not what actually happens in practice. And let me give you 3 examples, none of which count for the REF. One is Raspberry Pi, okay? Couldn't put that in the REF because there was no paper about it, but should I have not done it in the department and not encouraged it, not put resources into it? It would have been nuts, right? It's the biggest impact we've had, it wasn't in the REF. ARM, right? I was involved in ACORN in ARM in the early days. I can tell you that it couldn't happen today because it was that indirect thing. There wasn't a linear thing, and if you want the full story, I can take you chapter and verse, but just take it couldn't happen today. Or take a little company called Improbable. One of our graduates, no IP, forget IP, we infected him, and it's a very scalable, large-scale simulation platform. We do, like this happens in other bits of the university, do courses on innovation, encourage all that. Well, blow me, 80 people, they get a $500 million investment, it's first European unicorn. I can't understand it, but it's hardly right? Can I put it in the REF? No, but it was $500 million, it's real money, it's not peanuts. And there's only 80 of them, and they've hardly got any revenue. Now, do you see what I mean? That's reality. These things, ARM has happened, Improbable has happened, Raspberry Pi has happened, and they're all blanks on this agenda that everybody's trying, so I would like the politicians, it's not the politicians that's, I don't have any issue with the politicians, but the system to understand this sort of thing. And UKRI, which I worry about a lot, because it makes it all very monolithic in some conceptual sense. There isn't an ARPA, which would be a separate funding. And it's the only thing I'll put in, putting my Royal Society on. Royal Society, if I have anything to do with it, and as treasurer I do just a little bit, will concentrate on funding people, right? It will fund people and make sure that they're exposed to these other things so that that maximizes the chances at the high end, because it doesn't apply at all ends, of the impact, whether it's straight commercial money, tax, wealth, taxpayer paying for hospitals at that end, or it's more, underpinnings of science for the fundamentals or whatever it is. It'll be person-driven, that funding.
So, Andy, you're talking about the REF largely, but on this question of EU funding and how it might, the removal of it and replacement to some extent by government funding might change things. In your field, will that therefore have any impact?
Well, in my field, you don't require huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
What you require across the university sector, less taxation of the digital sector into other sectors, because we were probably the biggest subsidizer in terms of into other bits of the universities themselves. And don't, forgive me saying that, I still don't mind tax. It's just it's absurd in many cases how much goes away. So that's got to be understood. There is good money globally around. In the department next door, we've had a deliberate shift away from EPSRC to DARPA kind of money, about a 20% shift, a huge shift as a deliberate bet, which has worked very well. ERC has been great. On the industrial funding, now remember, for me, it's not about IP, it's about people. So if it's more difficult to recruit people, if it's more, it's the people mobility which actually, in my opinion, fundamentally underpins the collaboration with industry. And so it's not as easy as saying, because of Brexit, and it's the visas, it's not the politics. Can I recruit this person? Can I bring somebody in? How much of a headache is it to bring the next person in to my little company that I'm just going here and there from another part of the EU? Is it going to be as bad as from, a non-EU country? That sort of stuff. So that's where the industrial, for the digital sector is, in my experience.
I saw a hand up over here. Yes? I was about to... Do you want to wait for the, just throw it over?
I was about to make a point that Andy made to some extent, which is that I'm also a computer scientist, and computer scientists older than me did most of their collaboration with Americans, and those younger than me mostly collaborated with Europe because that's where the money is. But when you look where the real work is, the real centres of excellence and the stuff that's fizzing and buzzing and happening, it's mostly in America because that's where the industry is. So my view is if we're to turn Brexit from a problem into an opportunity, what we've got to do is instead of having to collaborate with Europe, find ways to collaborate with America instead. Now, some colleagues at the lab have done that to some extent by becoming subcontractors on big DARPA projects, and that's really great. But the question to the politicians is, can we do anything deeper and more structural? And my question to the research administrators is there anything can be done within the framework of UKRI to set up more long-term, more sustainable frameworks in which UK university teams can collaborate with teams in the USA and elsewhere?
Okay, yes, Tom.
I mean, I'll pick up the funding one, right? That's dead easy. And you're right. I mean, the whole, in terms of where the industry links are. So bipartite agreements with people like NSF can be a bit of a pain to organise, but can be done. I'll plug my own research council. We've released a call specifically for matching with other initiatives, for other critical mass labs to link with other critical mass labs to do that. And the other announcement that was in the white paper was for international fund which would target exactly that model of linking with other countries in that bipartite way. So that's something that is on the kind of funding and the kind of funding agenda, and how you make that generally more sustainable. I think is a longer term set of issues which does tie us into a broader discussion. I do want to reflect off this question though. The thing that strikes me about Brexit is the ways in which it's like a Gordian knot. You pull one thread and you suddenly find yourself in a different government department or in a different part of the world. And I think the complexity of what's there amplifies every conversation that we're having. So you very quickly find yourself in the world of immigration or visas or a whole sets of things. And so I think that's going to take a while to work out. I think UKRI, I do think that Mark has publicly stated and continually states a commitment to foundational research. I think that isn't something that he doesn't believe in and doesn't champion. I think the danger and dilemma is the complexity of innovation. People like simple models, and the problem is when you try and say it's complex, it gets quite hard, but it is quite complex, it is quite messy. There are a whole host of things there, and I think that's always going to be a tension in any innovation system.
Julian, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting question. And the argument for saying we should work with people outside the EU was true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and will continue to be true. And while there is this argument that we should take this opportunity of Brexit to work with other people, it seems to me that if we liberated all the time that's being spent sorting out Brexit and use that instead just to sort out everywhere else, it would be easy. But I've seen this argument many times. We had a debate before the referendum in Westminster about university sector and research. And there was a really interesting case that was made by somebody who was speaking for Brexit, who said that their objection to the EU was that it was racist, that it meant that it was easier for a German student to get into the UK than a Ghanaian or a Pakistani student to come here. And their solution, therefore, was to make it harder for the German. Now, I actually do take that argument, that it is slightly odd to say that people from this nationalities we like more than others. I can see why it's there. But actually, the internationalization should have happened before. It is really important, I think, with the US, also with China, because, and the rest of Asia, because as Chris says, there is some amazing stuff there. We actually have, where I work now at Jesus, Charles Chen Yidan, who's one of the founders of Tencent, is coming at the end of the month to spend a few days with us. I'm always amazed how many people have never heard of Tencent. It's, I think, one of the 5 biggest companies in the world. Absolutely huge, doing some really interesting stuff in technology, not the same way that we would do it, but we need to start finding out what is being done and how to interact with all of those people. And that ultimately comes down to, when it comes to people, liberalising all of those immigration issues wherever people come from.
Yes, Brian.
So 2 quick points, if I may. First of all, in terms of the links with America, actually it's one of the things that the government did very recently to have a US-UK broad science agreement. And actually there's a colleague in the audience, Mark Thompson, whose work on the deep underground neutrino experiment was a £65 million commitment as part of that flagship overall umbrella agreement. So we have got some of the things in place to help. As Tom said, there's a lot more other things, and this is where we can really influence those, change those. And then the only other point I wanted to make was back to the, will UKRI work? And it will need that both the flexibility and adaptability. It will need the people side to absolutely have that agility. But I'd also say there are some strategic things that will prevent perhaps just a plethora of institutes being put in random order. And one of the things I'm looking at actually also with Tom is the ability to have the first time a proper roadmap of what we've got in our big research infrastructures, from the social science to the arts and humanities to the medical sciences and the physical sciences. At the moment, we don't really have that map of what we've got, yet alone where we're going to make those future investments. So if we get both of those elements right, we're going to have it made.
There's a hand up at the back, if you can throw the orange box backwards.
Thank you. So I'm struck by the fact that we're in a very defensive posture when we're talking about these things, and yet you compare that to the 40s, where science, and particularly physicists, were using science to connect to different countries across the world. In fact, they were pioneering the connections and trying to bring this community together. So one of the things I think we maybe lose from the EU is some of that science leadership. And I wonder if the panel want to reflect on where science leadership, actually, to connect across the world should maybe come from.
Thank you for that thought. We're coming to an end. I just wanted to give people also the chance. Here we are at this moment where we have a new education minister. We have a new minister for higher education. They should be in a listening mode at this point, especially from an institution like the Cavendish and Cambridge. Any thoughts from anyone of messages that you would like to give to our decision makers around these questions, things that have not been aired yet already? Yes. Nice messages, says Heidi.
This is partly a question and partly an observation. But many funding applications, particularly as an early career researcher, require me to say in advance what I'm going to discover and when I'm going to discover it. So do the panel therefore disagree with Einstein's assertion that if we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research?
Good point. That's certainly a message worth repeating. Any other thoughts from anyone? Yes, there's a hand I can see up over there.
We've had quite a lot of points about how Brexit and all this stuff is quite depressing or bad looking for our future as scientists. I guess I'd just say to the people in government, we really need a forward-looking, and not just to 2020 when we've left and we're kind of just on the verge of going. We need a positive vision. I don't want to go, but if we are going, we actually need something. We need a plan, we need clarity, and we need to know something so that I know that if I'm going to do science in the future, I should stay here, because otherwise I know that if I go to Europe, there is a plan in Europe. I know what the plan looks like in Europe. I know how it works. I need to know what the plan is here and that it's positive so that I have a reason to stay here.
Anyone else? I can see some hands up at the back. Yes, let's take these comments.
Hello. We've talked a lot about funding for science, but I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on quantifying which parts of the funding are used for core science and which parts are used for the administrative parts of science which we need for running science, doing grant applications and assessing grant applications and measuring how grants are doing and doing all of that. And what's the ratio that that is at the moment and how we could move in that direction, in a better direction?
I really feel I want to answer that.
Go, very quickly then, Tom. Go on.
No, I really feel I want to answer that because I know the figure.
Go on.
It's 1.7%. The UK system is the most efficient, 1.7%. NSF's figures 7.
Yes,
Norway's figures 13. Right? We're an extremely lean organisation.
And I understand. So my question wasn't about how much the research council spend on administration on their side, but it's the time of the researchers, how much time they spend on doing these other things versus doing research, and how do we quantify that, and what do we do about that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's a question for Chris.
There's another hand up just in front. Yes, go ahead. Quick. Yeah.
I think all the panel have commented on the importance of people attracting and retaining the best researchers into Cambridge and the UK as a whole. But as a research sector, obviously there are some quite significant structural problems with the recruitment into and retention in the sector of researchers, especially because of the pinch point after postdoc, and then the uncertainty or obscurity of pathways for people into the research sector outside academia and how that happens. So what would the panel's messages be to government and to funding bodies to try and resolve those structural problems for the sake of the sector and the researchers who are doing the research?
Any other hands up? Did I miss anyone? Yes, 2 over this side, and they'll be the last ones.
Just to reinforce on the Brexit thing, it's not going to be solved by money. Countries like Switzerland and Germany have had more money sustained over many decades, and we are here as Europeans, and it's true also in the high-tech sector. And we're here because this country was the most modern within Europe. It was the most pragmatic. It was where we could come because they all speak English. Now, all this made the country special, and that 16% or so people who are European and working here are very successful. They're not even the average Europeans, they're most mobile. They're the people who are prepared to move and invest and come here and spend their lives here. So all this is really at risk, and it's not just going to be by keeping a flat budget that people are still going to come here and are going to remain here. This thing has to be reversed. I mean, for science to work and for this country to remain number one as it is now, it's got to be reversed because science is global, and if this becomes one small piece, a bit like a little Switzerland, Switzerland isn't the number one, and it's putting more money into science.
Thank you. Gentleman up there. Thank you very much. I'm not going to come back to the panel because we've reached 3 o'clock and I've been told firmly there's much more happening today. Just to sum up some of those final comments then, the need for science leadership, the need for a plan and clarity so people know whether they should invest in looking at a future to stay here. The question of pay, that wasn't going to go away. The question of how much it costs researchers to spend so much time making grant applications, the need for a pathway for postdocs, and the need for us to still think big so that we don't turn into a little Switzerland. I'd like to thank our marvellous panel who've given us a really great session this afternoon, and thank all of you for taking part, and the technicians who made it happen. Thank you.